Good evening. Welcome to Living While Black, Blue, and Pink. My name is Charlene Brown Wyans. Today is April 28th, 2021. That's relevant because 1 year and 1 month ago, in the midst of a pandemic, our country was catapulted deeply into conversations about social justice, social injustice, race, and police reform. Ladies and gentlemen, over a year ago, a year and a month ago to this day, we all witnessed on camera the death of George Floyd. And as you know, almost a year ago, I launched Living While Black, Blue, and Pink with an ensemble of women officers because I felt I wanted to share with you and share the community, and as my way of giving back during this tumultuous time, the perspectives of women, women officers, and women officers of color. And as I said to you then, as I continue to say now, we need to move toward change and we need to move toward reform. Even in the midst of the verdict that happened last week, there's still been several shooting incidents that we are now moving toward, which just highlights the importance of us moving to change. And change starts with us. And that's why this evening I am proud to partner with Light Switch Learning and to talk about a way that we can constructively bring about change. Before I introduce our special guest for this evening, I'd like to introduce again one of my roundtable buddies, one of my partners, one of the main players in this, Flora Kryn. Flora, how are you? And Flora, do you want to add anything to these welcomes?
Peace and blessings, everyone. Like Charlene said, we've been friends for many, many years, even before she became a police officer, rising to the top, leaving as a deputy inspector. So we started from the beginning all the way to the end. It's a pivotal time we're living in, and I am so glad having open dialogue and keep on going. Even though there have been convictions, it has not ended right there. We need to continue on the fight because, as you know, there's still shootings out there and there's still fatalities. So we must continue to how do we look at police reform and what should we do? So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for that. And I totally agree. So the question now is the what? What do we do? And one of the things that we have been doing, and one of the things that this whole incident has brought out is that people are now talking. And in communities of color, we have that saying, the talk. And we all know what the talk is. That's the talk that we have with our young brothers, with our sons, letting them know about how to act around the police, what to do when you're confronted with the police, what to do when you're stopped by the police. But we also now need to have another talk. And that other talk is about how do we reimagine policing and what are the real issues, because it's such a layered challenge that we're dealing with. And so our guest this evening has taken a stand at this, and he has created a graphic novel called Black and Blue, and I'd like to introduce him, and his name is Jared Sams. Jared Sams, welcome to Living While Black, Blue, and Pink.
Hey, how you guys doing?
We're doing good. We're doing good. So, Jared, why don't you just tell us a little bit about Black and Blue?
Yeah, so Black and Blue is a graphic novel. We built it as like an education tool, where it's for grades 6 to 12, and last year was nuts. But I mean, like, if you think about all the social injustice and just relationship between police and the Black community in general over many years, it was just a book that we figured would help young people kind of help process what's happening, right? I know adults who have trouble really processing what happened. So we wanted to build a tool for that. And so the book we built is called Black and Blue, and it's about a character. His name's Jackson. He's having a bit of a crisis of identity. He's a young African-American, and he's also a newly sworn in officer of the NYPD. and he's proud to be both, right? But you know, his first day is on the day when the George Floyd footage kind of went big. You know, when everyone's eyes were on that video and those, you know, just under 9 minutes of, you know, tragic footage. Yeah, and you know, he's trying to understand himself in this. He's trying to understand his place in this. He's trying to understand what he can do, whilst balancing, you know, his need to be both, right? Yeah.
Great, thanks. And so I'd like to also, before we continue this conversation with Jared, introduce Steve Sussman from Sussman Education and Light Switch Learning. Steve, thank you so much, and thank you for joining the show, and thank you for joining the panel. How are you this evening?
Having me, and you know, I'm so excited. You know, part of our mission over the last 10 years has to help our underserved communities across New York City and across the country, and having experts such as everybody in the panel today that believes in this cause so much. It's so great to hear from all of you.
Great. Again, welcome and thank you. We're going to ask you some questions, Steve. So thank you for standing and for jumping in to be a panelist. So Jared, I know that you also are an illustrator. So can you sort of share with the audience, why did you decide to tell this story as a graphic novel? You could have written, you could have told poetry, and you're a drawer, but why a graphic novel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just think there's something very immediate about art, about, you know, seeing the face of your hero, right? It helps really kind of, put a face to the struggle, put a face to the conflict. You know, not that, you know, obviously a lot of amazing things have been done in prose and all that stuff, but yeah, my draw toward the graphic arts is that, right? Is this notion of kind of combining prose with, you know, art and the amazing things you can do, you know, with that. Like, you know, the Black community is sort of, you know, there's a lot of bold artistic statements, you know, that I think there's a visual quality, whether that be like old African art or, you know, like the graffiti kind of like, you know, a movement. There's a lot of bold artistic statements that I feel like I try to tap into and try to sort of to use as a tool to get my messages across.
And so, you know, I'm not really, I used to be a comic book head, but I'm probably going to date myself. And Jared, you might be a little bit younger than me. So like, I used to read like Wonder Woman and some of the DC titles, and, you know, the original Superman and Mad Magazine. Does anybody remember any of those things? But Flora really, really enjoys comic books. And when she looked at your graphic novels, she noted your style, and I had no clue. So Flora, why don't you share with me?
I'm looking at the style that you have. It's very superhero-ish, especially like when you was talking about Pop Pop, which is one of the characters in your book. And you made Pop Pop almost like Superman, the way he came out of the flames and the look on his face. It was very Supermanish for me, and I loved it. I think it will grasp, especially that the grades that you're doing. Kids are visual, so this graphic novel, which to me is like, as a kid would say, one big comic book, is a good read. I think they will get something out of this, and it's colorful. It has the right colors, such as the purples and the blues, and the variation of different colors of people. I see that you have an Asian police officer, which is wonderful. Black, white. So you have variation of colors in here, and it looks great. It pops out at you. So good job on the illustration.
I appreciate that. I'm blushing. You just can't see it. No, I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, like, especially for the pop-up scene, you know, Jackson, the main character, he's sort of torn, you know, because obviously, like I said, he's a police officer, but he's also a Black man. So, but he's drawn to policing because his pop-up, his grandfather, was a police officer. He actually died in, as one of the rescue services officers during 9/11. And so that's something that in his head, when he sees police officers, he sees heroes, he sees, he sees people making a difference, and he wants to be a part of that. So that's kind of one side of his kind of thought process. So yeah, I'm glad that came across.
So now that we're on characters, why don't you tell us about some of the other characters? So there's Jackson and Dante, and then there's Pop. So why don't you explain the entire, each of the characters?
Yeah. So I mean, So Jackson, the main character, he's going through this identity crisis, and for him, he's torn between like all the, he needs all these police officers. His grandfather's a police officer. He sees them in such high regard. So he's inspired by his grandfather. He calls him Papa, right? Meanwhile, he has a brother who, is kind of, like I said, they both have the same parents. They're both, they have a mother and a father. They're both raised in really great environments, but they both see activism a little bit different, right? We use a quote in the book called "Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we must all protest." And that's a Martin King Jr. quote, which is kind of like the point of the book, right? It's the idea that we all need to protest. We all need to speak up in the way that we feel comfortable speaking up. So with Jackson, it's about kind of making a difference through, the system, being a part of the system and serving his community that way. But he has an older brother who believes that, who uses his voice as an activist, right? He's all, like when all, during all the protests and the craziness, oh yeah, there we go, characters there. All the protests, everything that happened last summer, Dante is on the ground. He's there activating everyone. He's there doing his best to use his voice to speak out against police violence through that way, right? And so again, like Jackson he's trying to figure out, because obviously he's very upset by the George Floyd murder. He's upset in general by police violence and social injustice, but he's just trying to figure out a way that he could best use his voice, right? Best act, kind of thing. I don't think I'm alone in saying that, like, whenever you see a young Black person murdered by the police or otherwise for no reason, or at least suspicious circumstances, you just feel outrage. You feel angry, and outrage and anger. I think that's not always a bad thing. That could be good fuel, but it's not an engine, right? You need something to help you use that energy as action, right? And I think the story of this is about sort of figuring that out for those two characters.
What about Chandra and Mom and Pop, Chandra and Booker?
So Chandra and Booker, they're just the parents. It was important to me that these Dante and Jackson, that they have a strong family, right? They have strong support there. Like, there's definitely a lot of cliches in regards to Black families in fiction. I want to avoid that. So I want to give them like a good base, right? Like they have a mother, they have a father, they're loved, and they have strong conviction. The brothers butt heads about what they want and what they need to do, how change can come about. And it was important for me to kind of anchor that with the audience, knowing that, like, they're not broken. You know what I mean? They're not like making up for something. They believe what they believe because they were instilled with strong views, strong morals. They both come from that place, and their disagreement and their perspective, their philosophies are built around that. Built around strength, not anything else.
Yes, and and I'm glad you mentioned the strong Black images and images that so people, young people look at the comic book, they can see themselves. And I was really drawn to that. And one of the things that really, I have some favorite moments of the graphic novel. I'm going to ask Flora what her favorite moment, and maybe Steve what his favorite moment is in the graphic novel. But one of the favorite moments was, to me, was when Pop Pop said, "I don't fight to serve, I fight for what this country can be." Because Pop Pop is also, he fought in the Vietnam War, again, something that's been controversial in this country. Then he became a lieutenant in the NYPD and then died in 9/11. And when, in my opinion, because I grew up in a policing family, and as a person of color, that was sort of odd and rare. But one of the narratives that needs to be shown, and one of the themes that I like that you portrayed, is that there are people of color that join policing that want to make a difference. In fact, I was watching something on TV this evening, and Kamal is having a show on CNN, and they were having this conversation about, will all of this stuff about George Floyd make people not want to become police? And they talked about tearing it up and reimagining police and what it looks like. But I really think there are people of color that want to make a change from the inside. So I really like that you developed that. And I think that's a theme that can be used for educators and people across the country to share and talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I can't lie. Like when I was a kid, like when I was a kid, my hero was like Axel Foley, Eddie Murphy and Beverly Hills Cop, yeah, and maybe it's a little bit different now for kids in terms of, how fiction kind of shows police officers versus when I was younger. But yeah, like, in a perfect world, you just want to feel like when things go wrong, you want to be able to, pick up a phone and call a police officer, right? Like, you want to be able to have that trust. And so like that was tough because, again, I was saying before, I was so I was actually approached about this project. It wasn't necessarily my complete idea, and gotta give props to Light Switch Learning. They've really great, about wanting to have culturally resonant, culturally responsible content, right? So I was approached about this project, but I wasn't sure if I could, right? Like I said, I had a lot of ideas and a lot of things I wanted to say, and in my mind, it wasn't really coming across, right? Like I didn't know how to say the things I needed to say, and I wasn't sure if I was in a place to say them. But upon further kind of thought, it just occurred to me that we're asking. I think we asked the police to be accountable. We asked the police to we ask so much of the police, right? For them to, in regards to how they can be better at policing our communities. So I think it's one of the things that we have the responsibility to do, civilians, is to know what we want from them, right? Is to know to know what a good police officer looks like, and to speak on that. I think it's easy. I don't think it's easy, but we hear a lot of people speak on what bad policing is, but we also need to keep in mind that we need to speak on what good policing is. And that was important for me for this book as well, is like, and maybe it's, optimistic in a lot of ways, but to show a side that's like, this is what I want from policing, right? This is, and that was important for Jackson, even for Pop Pop. Like the thing about Pop Pop that was interesting to me, the reason why he was a hero wasn't necessarily just because he would jump into a situation to save lives. I think most, I think that's what police officers do, even the ones who might be compromised in other ways. I think what makes a Pop Pop such a hero is how he de-escalated situations, right? Is how he approached, policing on the street on an everyday basis. It wasn't about, it's not always about being a big hero that can, beat people up or something like that. Sometimes it's about stepping back and using another tact, right? Using another philosophy or tactic aside from, the more, violent or rough ones, you know what I mean? And so I think that's what Jackson got from Pop Pop. You know, he's trying.
That's a spoiler alert. That was a spoiler alert. Read the graphic novel. Find out whether Pop Pop rubbed off on Jackson and Dante.
You know,
And there are some scenes when they're tested, right?
Right. That's true. That's true. That's fair. That's well, I will say Jackson is trying to live up to Pop Pop's example. Whether or not he does or not, that's for you to find out once you read the book.
Well, I think both of them are tested in that way to see if they can, if they show up in that way as Pop Pop would have wanted them to.
Right.
But going back to some of the police story side, more of Jackson's story, just wondering, and Flora and I were talking about this prior, how did you do your research? Because, you know, we were talking about some of the things that we thought were spot on being a police officer, because whenever I watch a TV show, Law and Order, I'm looking side-eye like, they don't really do that. Ooh, that was pretty good. So how did you do your research? Because there's one scene in particular that's my favorite. When I get the favorites, I want to talk to you about.
Oh yeah. You know, honestly, it's just a lot of fear. I say, saying it, a lot of fear goes a long way. And so like, I wanted this book to appeal to police officers, right? Law enforcement. I wanted this to be a tool, not just for, you know, activists, but for law enforcement. I want everyone to be able to read this book. And so it's important for me, as someone who's not a police officer, to present it, you know, in a way that a police officer can read it and doesn't roll their eyes, right? Like you hear that a lot from like police. Like I talk to, you know, friends who are police officers. And, you know, they'll be like, oh, I can't watch that stupid movie because it's like it's crazy, it's nuts. They're not even trying to be authentic. So I was just I just making sure when I research every little thing, just try to like. In fact, I did so much research that the editors had to kind of, you know, hit back a little bit and go, okay, that's a little, come on, all right, let's step back a little bit.
Steve's laughing.
Not be that authentic.
Steve's laughing. Steve, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, actually, what I wanted to hear from actually all three of you, but Charlene and Flora, I want to hear from you first from the law enforcement side. I mean, you know, it's been such a challenge these days, and a lot of civilians have had the opportunity to take advantage of law enforcement lately. And we've seen some of the stories, the kids that attacked a police car, and NYPD, I guess today, are asked to back down in a lot of situations. What would the two of you from the law enforcement side of things like kids to talk about? Because the idea of this title, from Jared's vision and from our vision, was to make sure that we get students talking about these types of issues. And by the way, speaking of that, my favorite part is tension in the story, because this isn't a sugar-coated story. Like, this is a raw story, and this is a very complex issue. So what would you like to see kids talking about when it comes to this battle between law enforcement and the right to peacefully protest?
Mm-hmm. So I think I'll start, because when I read part of the graphic novel, some of that tension played out in my old household, because I was sort of faced with that, with my son wanting to go out and protest and me not wanting him to protest. But I think because of what happened, there are so many emotions. And I think this graphic novel is a way to help sort of channel that, so everything can kind of come out first. All of the anger, all the feelings of frustration, because there's so much anger that I don't know, people know they haven't pinpointed all of the anger and categorized all of the anger, which is to be understood. So that's one of the things I appreciate about this book, because here's an opportunity to actually direct it to something that's not a person, to this book. And you can yell and scream and talk about all the issues. And then now you hear the issues. Now you can unpack them and now take them apart. You know, the frustration about things not changing, it always looking like it's happening to me in my neighborhood. Why is it? Because I personally, you know, even when I heard the verdict, there was a part of me that was surprised that a verdict was going to be guilty. And I had to grapple with that in myself. So I think there's so many different things that young people will come out of that I don't want to pinpoint one thing. So I think let's get all the anger out, because once we get all the anger out, now we can come together and start discussing the issues. What is it that we want? What is it that we need? How can we assist in law enforcement? What can we demand of law enforcement to bring to us? So that's why I appreciate the book. Flora.
Well, here's the thing. A lot of young people, when we do have little round tables, they usually ask the police officers, why do you harass us? Why are you always stopping us? And normally, and it's true, when a police officer comes upon them, they usually don't, well, first of all, it's always for a job or a call, which means they're coming to a situation, and it's not always pleasant at times, depending on what the situation is. And these kids live in the neighborhood. They see exactly what goes on, even if they're just going home or they're just hanging out. They feel targeted. So what does the police officer do when they come upon a situation? They gather everybody up, treat everybody the same. And and this is part of their norm, and they hate it. They hate it with a passion. They don't get the answer. They don't get the respect. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of these kids, they got mouths, just like in the book here, when the kids were on the floor and they were mouthing off. And there are some police officers that do engage with them. It just escalates the problem. That's not me. You got to listen. Just like what the book says, you got to listen. And I know sometimes, and they do teach us this in training, we got to pull them apart and pull them away from each other to get the story. Unfortunately, a lot of the police officers in situations kind of forget that at times. So this is why I'm so much into police reform, to kind of drill that in. But these kids are crying out. They want to be heard. They want to be counted. They want to be treated like people. There's not one little Black boy I know who lives in the city who has never had an encounter with a police officer, may it be good, bad, or injustice. They never could just walk by without thinking, oh my God, is that police officer gonna stop me? That has to change, that whole attitude. Because sometimes you just got a kid who's just coming from a library. Not every kid is coming from robbing somebody. We have to get that mental out of our heads. But that has a lot to do with environment. It has a lot to do with where you live and everything else. We can't put everybody in one cesspool. So we need to have more dialogue. And the police departments, they try, but they only try when things happen. It has to be a continual thing. It can't be every time a situation occurs.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And that's how I feel.
You asked for it, Steve. That's what this show is about, for us to just rip off the Band-Aids and to really have those conversations. So Flora, what was your favorite part of the graphic of Garrett's book?
I'm gonna be honest with you. I like the character, the white officer Dennis. There's a Dennis in every precinct. And I say this because he likes to work. He likes to put on his uniform. He wants to have a calm and peaceful day. He wants to eat his Italian hero. He wants to just have a great day. And yeah, he comes across situations, but look what he did when they came to the bodega. And I'm sorry for all those who didn't get an opportunity to read this yet, but there's a scene where they come on to a situation, and he pulls the police officers apart. He takes the one who's hot-headed and he takes them outside and said, let's get this cleared out. And, and the kids were sitting with another officer. He is that cop that likes to de-escalate a situation, but he sees that it's bigger than him. There's not enough Dennises in the precinct. And, there's a lot of cops that don't appreciate that. The Dennises in precincts are the ones who don't want to rock the boat. They want to keep the boat riding smoothly. And it's hard. It's hard to do so. And what I liked about Dennis, he didn't see Jackson as a color. He saw Jackson as a police officer. He even made a comment to him like, this will be the next police commissioner, just because of the respect of his grandfather. So the Dennises, unfortunately, they don't thrive to be higher up. They just like where they are. And unfortunately, they don't speak up enough to tell people what is right and what is wrong. They try to smooth out situations. And I've met so many Dennises in my career. It's unfortunate that they don't have a voice, because they don't want a voice. They just want things to be smooth. They just want to have a nice day at the office. That one of my favorite characters.
That's interesting to hear, actually. I mean, because like I said, I'm not a police officer, but I've been in work situations where I've been surrounded by many Dennises in my life, right? Where someone who means well and like,
Yes.
but they're kind of oblivious at the same time, you know. And it's like when you tell them, when they know they want to do better, but they, like I said, like sometimes they confuse, you know, peace with, you know, quiet, right? Like it's maybe not the same thing, right?
They don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah, and yeah, it's that I'm glad Dennis. I was concerned about that because I want to make sure that Dennis wasn't. I didn't want to make the police villains, right? Because I don't believe that, right? Like I've been fortunate in my interaction with police officers throughout my life where I've never, you know, I've been stopped before under dubious sort of claims, but I've never had like necessarily a bad interaction with a police officer, right? Even
You know what we call that in the street, Jared? An endangered species. That's what you are.
Well, I think that's why it was important for me. That's why I think I decided to do the book, right? I decided I think I do have a voice for the book because like my experience with the cops wasn't one where it was like, oh, you know, they need to go away or whatever. It was very much like, I don't know. I know a lot of great police officers. I know I've been in a community where I live in a neighborhood that is not great, but we have police officers who are very responsive, who are active in the community, who talk to. I know officers' names. You know what I mean? Like it's. So for me, it was different. But also, I'm not blind. I also understand. I know I have people close to me. I understand that there are communities that aren't that lucky. There are people in my community who aren't that lucky. So, but I'm glad Dennis came across and he felt authentic.
Jared, you've been in the right place at the right time, but sometimes all of us don't have that luck. And that's you know.
And so similarly for me, that bodega scene to me, like that was just my favorite scene because there was just so much going on. So if I get it wrong, let me know, Jared. So Jared gets called to the scene. I mean, not Jared. I mean, Jackson gets called to the scene, and these two kids were under arrest for stealing gum from a bodega. Now that's larceny, and that's something that you can be arrested for. So when they come up on the scene, the two kids are sitting there underneath the counter, and the guy's yelling at them. These kids do this all the time. They're stealing. So they're trying to sort all this stuff out. So then Jackson actually starts to speak to the kids, and of course, kids at first they're gonna lie, right? They're gonna be like, "Oh, I didn't steal it," and then later on they break down. They say they do. So in that moment, Jackson then has a bit of empathy and says, "Wait a minute, let's put this in perspective. We're getting ready to arrest two kids for stealing gum, just a stick of gum. And guess what? When I was little, I stole. How many of us in the audience might have grabbed something from a store or was dared by a friend to do something like that? And in that moment, the reality hit him, and he's like, no, this is wrong.Ese kids shouldn't be arrested. Now, this is when the reality versus what happens in real policing, and then he challenges the officers who is called their collar, their arrest. And that's when the interaction between Jackson and the two officers become heated because first of all, you don't do that. You're not going to say somebody's on the arrest, uncuff them because that's my collar. How dare you do that? But where the realism happened is that dirty little secret that we want you to know or don't want you to know about that threat that, hey, if you don't do things the right way, we're not going to back you up. And there's so much danger that you have to face as a police officer. You're going onto a scene, you don't know what's happening, you only know what you've been told. Sometimes that information is giving you the worst picture because you never know when you're going to walk into that face of danger. And the one thing that you do know is that you have the support of your brothers and sisters if something goes wrong. So when someone says to you, when you're in it by yourself, we're not going to help you, that's serious. And that's one of the big challenges to breaking that culture. And so they say that to him, really, you did this? Number one. And number two, you're making me lose face because we've already stepped in to the situation. We've already made the determination. These kids are going to get collared. And now you're telling us not to in front of somebody else. How dare you? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, so that was just so real. For me, and that's why it was my favorite scene. And then to me, the theme that I think young people can walk away with, and what maybe the older generation we have to do a better job at, and I think younger people do, is having that sense of personal responsibility, that stepping up, that stepping out and standing up and saying something in the midst when everybody else is saying no. Yes, you're saying no. And I think that's one of the main themes of Black and Blue, being able to take personal responsibility and step up and speak out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's key, right? And, you know, and like I said, you know, sometimes that voice, there's no right way to speak up, right? There's no one right way to speak up. It's just on you to speak up, you know, and I like that Jackson is someone who, you know, his brother disagrees the venue in which he's speaking out, but Jackson's doing what he can, right? Yeah, well, that's great. I'm glad that you guys like. Actually, I'm blushing. You just can't see it.
So I think we have a bit of a video that we're going to show, and then we'll take then I have a couple of questions to ask Jared, and then we can take some questions from the audience. So thank you for that video. So that video sort of gives everyone out there that's listening sort of an overview of the storyline. It's a great teaser. It's a great trailer. Again, I think it's a great way to tell a story. It's a great way to show the world how one issue can have so many different points of view, and how it can all come together, and use this as a vehicle for change. But before we go, I just have to, because, you know, I'm from the East Coast and you're from the West Coast. So, you know, I always want to have like a little versus going. So Jared, Tupac or Biggie? Tupac or Biggie?
Oh,
no pressure.
Gosh.
No pressure.
There's no right answer to this. Like, there's whatever answer I give. Okay, all right. I'm gonna give the boring answer.
Okay.
Biggie is the better lyricist, right? But I'm from California, and like, Pac is like, he's everything. So you know, it's I'm blinded by my where I live in America. So sorry, I can't give an honest answer there.
Okay, you kind of dodged that. I'm gonna let you go. Let you go. Not on this one. Lakers or the Nets. Lakers or the Nets.
Wait, say it.
Lakers or the Nets.
Oh my God. You know, I think if I said the Nets, they'd throw me out of LA. I think that's a law. I think it's a law somewhere that if I speak ill of the Lakers, that I have to revoke my my Los Angelesness. So I gotta say Lakers. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna jump in on that one, by the way.
Okay, please do.
And I'm gonna give an answer that hits both coasts. I love Biggie and Tupac, and they both get at least a 9 out of 10 in my musical book, and I love music. You can see my guitar in the background. But I give Tupac the slight edge, but I'm a huge Brooklyn Nets fan. So giving a little love to both coasts. I do want to put Jared on the spot really quickly, because before we finish up, I'd love to know, Jared, your vision for what you want students to talk about. I mean, this book is all about one story that captures a very challenging time in American history. And I think what's going to be really impactful is taking one story and creating ongoing conversations. what does that conversation look like to you? I know that'll evolve, but what does it look like to you ideally right now?
Well, I'm a big proponent of advocacy through art, right? So for me, what I hope, like I know there's a lot of racial components to this kind of to everything here, right? But what I want kids, youth to take away from this is just be empowered, right? Like find your voice, use it, right? Like what you're going through, what the world is going through is nuts. It's crazy. It's hard to process, but it's kind of on us to do so, right? And it's hard, and it's tough. We may come into conflict with the people we love, and we may end up looking at the world differently in the end. But it's important for us to know what it is we want to say, and how it is the world we want to live in, what that world looks like, and what we can do to make that happen, right? I guess that's kind of the hope I ultimately have for it. We kind of not ignore, but we look past the race component, and we just see that, there's humans on both sides, and we really have to learn those basic skills on how to just talk to people, how to deal with people, how to understand the other side, even if we disagree with them. If anything, just so we can understand ourselves better and how we can get our own point of view across.
Thanks. So we have a couple of questions. So the first question is, what words would you use to describe this book to a 14-year-old kid in the schoolyard?
Oh wow, that's a great question. What words would I use? Man, awesome, dope. Man, interesting is not a great word, but like, oh man, I'm too modest. You know what I mean? Like, the salesman in me, the Stan Lee in me wants to be like radical, like game changing. But it's a book. If I was a 14-year-old trying to tell my friend about it, it's just a book that gets that it talks about stuff that I'm maybe confused about, or I want to know more about, in a way that isn't like pretentious, right? Like it's just a book that shoots straight and gets you thinking, right? Like it doesn't have the answers necessarily, but it at least starts me down the path of trying to find the answers, right? It's empowering. Maybe that's what I want. I want a 14-year-old to tell another 14-year-old, here's an empowering book that gave me the tools to do something cool, to do something interesting, something to just do something, right?
Thank you. And so we are honored to also have in our viewing audience Cheryl Willis. And Cheryl Willis is not only a well-known correspondent in the New York area, she was also wrote your forward. And being the journalist that she is, she has a hard-hitting question for us. And she wanted us all to share our reactions about the verdict, and then how do we feel with the verdict and the continued shootings that have happened since then. So I'll let all of our guests go, and then I'll make a few comments. So Flora. You're on mute, Flora. You're still on mute.
Sorry. What was the question again? I'm so sorry.
How did you feel when the verdict was announced? And how do you feel now after the verdict that there's still shootings going on?
Okay, the present me. The present me is now a retired police officer from NYPD. I'm living in the South. I'm a Christian woman, first and foremost. I didn't feel sorry for him, because every time I saw Derek Chauvin with his knee and his hands in his pocket, I just thought of it as inhumane. When I saw Derek Chauvin in the courtroom looking bewildered, I just said, my God, this man doesn't have a clue of what is going to happen to him next. It's over. And I didn't feel sorry for him, but I felt that, you know, I'm not the one to judge him. You know, God's going to judge him. I'm not the one to celebrate. I don't feel a celebration in this. We have so much work to do, you know, but I was satisfied with the verdict. I don't understand why people felt it would have went a different way when it was all in front of us. We have to change that narrative. We really do. I mean, justice is justice. And I think he got what he deserved. And hopefully police officers can see this. I hope they put this in their training that, you know, this is not what we do. Okay. I always wondered, and quickly, I always wondered if there weren't any cameras there, if there weren't any people there, would this have gone a different way? So I'm satisfied with the verdict, but like I said, we still have a lot of work to do. I'm not happy.
Steve, I'm gonna put you on the spot. How do you feel about this?
It's such a situation where we needed a verdict of this type. Otherwise, it would just allow for all the racial inequities and the racial profiling that had gone on for so many years. You know, I just had a conversation with a friend of mine. He's a stylist. He's a Black gentleman in his 60s, one of the best dressed, most stylish people you've ever seen. And I was shocked to hear from him that he says he's been stopped many, many times and racially profiled as well, even dressed to the nines on all. He doesn't walk out and get his paper without being dressed to the nines. And, you know, so being a Black adult or teenager, I can't understand and feel. And that's why it was so important for me as a white male to understand that struggle and to really get that out to the forefront. And I think this verdict is just opening that up. And I just love to hear you, Charlene and Flora, react to that, and maybe even hear a word from Cheryl if she wants to jump in on any of this as well. And thank you for inviting Cheryl.
Yeah, so I will weigh in, but I think I'll yield to Cheryl. I think Cheryl's going to join. Cheryl will also join us in audio. Good evening, Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, good evening, everyone. I'm thoroughly enjoying the conversation. And I am actually off tonight because our political team is taking over for the president's address. So this is much more interesting than anything going on right now. And I think I want to congratulate Jared on the book, and on all the comments are just so interesting and insightful. And I agree with what the other panelists just said. I agree with the verdict, but I do question whether we are going to see any kind of reform in light of the fact that you have a horrific case right now in North Carolina with a gentleman named Andrew Brown, whose family claims he was executed and shot in the head. And now there appears to be a major cover-up of the video. It's not being released to the media. And it makes me wonder, how far have we come since George Floyd almost 1 year ago, when now the police department has the video, the public and the family are demanding to see it, and they say no. So it just shows that this conversation, this national conversation about police shootings of unarmed Black men, needs to continue. And it's very disturbing what's happening right now in North Carolina.
And Cheryl, so thank you for raising that. And I totally agree with you. But so what I think the beauty, so to speak, of all of the means of communication that we have social media. We actually have individuals on the street that can capture these images. And so like in the George Floyd, in the Chauvin case, we
Mhm.
actually had direct evidence. I'm, the legal geek in me is going to come out. We didn't have circumstantial evidence. We didn't have what a witness saw or did. We actually saw it in black and white. But one of the things I think we have to remember, although we're having a national conversation about law enforcement in the United States is fragmented. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. So when we first have this conversation about culture, unlike other countries like the UK where there's one national police, we can't
Mhm.
have one conversation. We have to have 18,000 different conversations. And so what's happening in North Carolina, although it seems shocking to me, I'm not shocked by it, because you have this other police department that has this fractured culture that now says, no, we're going to do it the way we want to do it, and we're not going to disclose this evidence until we're ready to, which just shows that communities have to be more educated about our police and our policing system. So just because we're having this one conversation doesn't necessarily mean that it's trickling down to all 18,000, which is why some of the federal reform, the George Floyd Act, is really important. Some of the federal funding that goes to law enforcement agencies is really important, because we tie some of those things in, it can start to maybe crack away at some of the change. I personally believe sometimes, though, that law changes do not always beget culture changes. And so we have to have these conversations about how do we intrinsically change the culture. And so changing the culture then requires us to step in and have individuals that have strong senses of self and strong sense of personal responsibility, like what we saw in the Black and Blue a graphic novel. So that's how I feel about that. Unfortunately, I'm not shocked when I hear about more of the shootings, because there's a lot of culture change that has to happen.
Excellent point. That's very profound. And you would know because you're on the inside.
I was.
Was.
26 years.
We're not there anymore, Cheryl. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
We actually have a great question from CJ, one of the attendees for the webinar tonight. And the question is, how does the author feel about the movement to defund the police and instead fund community-based social services and invest in self-governance? Does this particular movement upset you, Jared, and other law enforcement officers? And if so, why? And maybe after Jared jumps in, I'd love to hear what the rest of you think.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not upset by that. Like, I feel like like I said, like what was said, there are so many different cultures, so many different, police agencies, right? Like it's not just one conversation; it's many conversations. Some communities are better at dealing with, other, I guess, hurdles, challenges than other police forces are. So, but I think that's a conversation that's totally worth having. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, right? Because it becomes political, right? In a way that shouldn't be political. Like in my mind, it's literally just, oh, cool. Like the people who are educated and have the training to handle people with issues with mental health or whatever, they are the ones we call to help the people who need that, right? Like this seems easy to me, but it's been politicized in such a way that it's confusing to me. So actually, I would love to hear what the people with actual law enforcement, histories have to say about that kind of stuff.
So for me, as you, Jared, that word defunding, not only it became sort of a soapbox sort of term that to make people feel better, but that's again another individual question. What does defunding mean to you? Because I think people said defund, but they didn't really want defunding. And I think by defunding, they sort of meant let's divert some of the responsibilities that police have to other people that can step in and do it differently or better. So for example, with the question of mental health, and historically, law enforcement agencies, when you talk about social structures and social control, law enforcement was one of the only agencies that's around 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And as a result, they started to take on duties that really law enforcement really shouldn't have been doing in the first place, but they do it, and there's no one else around to do it. And so when you had some of these incidents that happen with people that might have had mental challenges, police weren't trained for it in the first place. So sometimes when people say defund the police, they're saying, well, let's have other professionals come in that are trained to do that. But what people don't realize is the requirements and the training and the ability to have people like that round the clock has become a challenge, and it winds up again defaulting to the police. The second notion is when you say defund the police, you're defunding an agency, and I think the prosecution said it in the Chauvin trial, even in the midst of the fact that someone saw an officer harming, killing somebody, who did they call? They called the police. So when we talk about defunding the police, if you're not going to have the police, who are you going to have? And what makes you think that that person's not going to act in power? If you ever saw the book, The Lord of the Flies, right? Because power corrupts. So I think people were using money, which I think, pulling funding strings does get attention. But what does that mean? Because you're going to defund areas of the cities, of our cities, that need the police, and they're not going to have it. The areas where there might be more incidents of crime, guess what? They're not going to have it. And if you defund the police, who's going to determine how those funds are allocated? Because a police department is not willing to change and say, okay, then I'm not going to provide 2 officers in that area. So then when someone's grandmother gets shot, they're not going to have the police around because they were defunded. So so that's the part of the narrative that was a little bit upsetting to me, because if you defund the police, what are you replacing it with? And let's talk about who we're replacing it with, because some of the things that happen, you see happening within other agencies. And so that's how I feel about that conversation. Do I feel there should be more social services to support many of the challenges in many cities? Certainly. But Flora knows, and I know, there's been times that we have gone to situations where you bring in the psychologist and you bring in the doctor, and they go, you say if you had a prisoner that was hospitalized and you put him in the room, and the doctor would say, oh, take off the cuffs. And we're like, I don't think you should do that. And they take it off anyway, and the person just goes berserk and just beats up the doctor. We've seen that happen. So, that opens the door to the fact that we need to have other conversations about mental health and how do we deal with people and what do we do? Because these families that call the police when their sister and brother's acting violently, they can't handle them because they're acting violently. So when someone's acting violently, who do you bring in to deal with the violence and then also deal with the mental conditions? So it's a very layered issue, but it's about figuring out what defund means, what reimagining means. We need to start getting to those things.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jared, please.
No, I was curious, because it seems like the question people are asking, it's not so much defund the police, but like rethink the police, right? Like, what's a good way to do that, right? Well, I have you very smart people on the line here. Like, what's a good way to rethink the police? Like, what do you see the police force needs to do? What change do they need to make?
I personally think that it starts with a change in culture. Again, and so people change culture. And so you have to not only bring in new, fresh minds with fresh perspectives, but it's just like the same conversation we have in corporations. Then how do we spread that talent throughout the entire agency? Because we can put a Black commissioner or an Asian commissioner or a Hispanic commissioner or a Hispanic sheriff in a department, but if the sergeant and the captain and the lieutenant doesn't believe that, then it's not going to change. So culture change has to permeate the entire agency. And it's about making sure that there's people with like minds that understand what's needed. And what was the name of your dentists, and converting some of the dentists. And because a dentist could be tweaked to see things differently because they already understand how to make those connections, and making sure that those are the narratives. Again, I'm going to say, having the conversation about some of the unions that sometimes will stand out and make these broad statements that don't necessarily represent all of the department. And we have to remember, in the Chauvin trial, we saw something we never saw before. Everybody talks about, the blue wall of silence. There was no blue wall of silence in the Chauvin trial. You had officers from the very top coming out and saying, this does not represent us. And to me, that's the start of the change of culture.
Mm-hmm.
Flora's like, what she said.
Yeah, I'm actually curious how what Cheryl's thought is on how pivotal is it? Is it 3 other officers that will be tried later in the summer, Cheryl? And how pivotal that'll be to this whole movement?
I'm really enjoying this conversation, having these two queens and Jared share their thoughts. This should be on my show on New York One. I'm like, this is
call me.
I'm gonna call you now. Watch, careful what you ask for. But I mean, this is a riveting conversation, and this book is extraordinary. Congratulations again to Jared. Yes, there are 3 other officers who are going to be tried. And everyone's going to watch, but more than the other officers, we're watching the sentencing of Derek Chauvin in June, because there's some talk that underground, and I know the 2 sisters know what I'm about to say, that he might not get anywhere near the max. And now there's talk that he may get just a couple of years, which would be shocking. And so I think everyone's watching to see what's going to happen. And you know how they tried to drag Maxine Waters into this, the congresswoman, for allegedly saying something. Well, we know what she said, but in my mind, I'm like, what does that have to do with this trial? She was in California. She wasn't outside the courthouse. And so they're not done with efforts to try to save this man from what he did. So in addition to the 3 other officers who, in my opinion, need to be held accountable for their actions, as well as Chauvin's sentencing, we can't quite exhale just yet.
Cheryl, you're right. We can't exhale at all, because the police officer, the ex police officer, a woman who shot, I think his name was Gene Botham, the one in Texas. They're thinking about shortening her sentence for good behavior. So
exactly
you're
right.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. She got sentenced. She got a hug from the judge. She cried. But if it was me shooting somebody, because they walked in, I thought I went into the wrong place.
Right.
I'll be hung.
No hugs for you. No hugs for you.
No hugs for me. No hugs for me. Not even a prayer book. No hugs for me. Listen, I want to tell it to you straight. Defunding the police is a joke. Why? Because we always need new cars. And I've been on that typewriter forever. I'm so glad it switched over. The computers, technology, things cost money. Everything costs money. This is an agency that runs 24/7. Things break down. Sometimes we want to do things with the youth. They have a youth department. We can't take them anywhere. Why? Because we don't have any money. Then we have domestic violence, which was on the rise. So they joined the agencies with the police department so we can do something about domestic violence. That takes money. Everything we touch takes money. So when you say defunding the police, you're not hurting my pension. That's why I got a union. What you're really hurting is the agency, okay? And because my union is going to talk for me, and they're going to cry just like the teachers union, just like the hospital union, the fire department, sanitation. They're going to barter for their money. But when you say defund the police, I always ask the protester, what exactly do you want defunded? You know, do you want less police officers, or do you want more agencies there rather than having the police there? Because when there's a domestic violence, would you prefer a social worker going there instead of me? You know, gotta let us know, because what it comes down to is money. It's always about money. So I always tell people, choose what you want carefully, because when you defund the police, first neighborhoods are going to do it in is in the urban neighborhoods. That eye that sees everything, that's gone. The cop on the beat who's doing that extra overtime because that street needs a police officer, he's gone or she's gone. So we really got to, check what we want. Okay. I don't like living in a police state. Trust me. I really don't. But there's certain state and to be more effective. And if it means working with the youth, working with domestic violence, working with the church council, working with civic groups, I'm all for it. So, that's how I feel about defunding of police, the police department.
Well, definitely. So I think, as everyone can see, Black and Blue can be used as a vehicle to open the door to so many discussions. One of the things that I'm thinking is my hope and prayer, and I'm just going to put it out there in the universe. Again, many police departments are now going to be under federal monitors and under reform. And in their efforts to reform and to bridge conversations, this book, Black and Blue, could be used to have constructive conversations with young people. Again, educators can use this in their classrooms, conversations about social justice and how to move justice forward and move the needle forward. And what are the challenges? What are the issues that officers face? What are the conversations that are happening in our families, in our communities, and how we can move forward? So with that, I would like to thank everyone for being on the call, but I had one more question for Jared. Are you Dante or are you Jackson? Tell us, who are you really?
First of all, I want to say real fast, thank you to Cheryl. The first time I actually say this with my voice, but thank you so much for your support, your forward. You've been amazing. Thank you so much for that. Also, Jackson or Dante, we're both, right? I think that's the point, right? It's like, there's a little bit of both in all of us. I think I'm a little bit of Jackson, a little bit of Dante, I'm a little bit of Booker, a little bit of Chandra, a little bit of Dennis, you try to put yourself in each character, right? And each one is saying something that you think is true, that, you think, you're trying to say about the world, right? So yeah, I'm both, I think we all should strive for that, right?
Jared, I hope your book makes it down south where I am. God knows we need it. We really do.
We're all working.
We're a whole new world down here. We're a whole new world down here.
Steve, any final words?
I'd like to thank all of our great panelists. I'd like to thank all of the attendees. There were some great questions and great engagement at 8:30 at night. A bunch of people that hung around till the end. So thank you to everybody that made this possible and to the incredible conversation. Appreciate everyone.
Thank you. And again, thank you for that. And then again, to the audience, I can't thank you enough. We never imagined that a little under a year ago when we had this conversation that our first Living While Black, Blue, and Pink was streamed over 3,000 viewers. And so, we wanted to come back, we would have conversations, but we wanted to come back at the right time. And one thing that I do know from my heart is that these conversations need to continue and will continue. And we will continue to strive to give honest conversations about what it is to be a person of color, women of color, and women with law enforcement as we grapple with these issues moving forward. So again, I'd like to thank Jared, thank him for his inspiration. Thank you for birthing. And, he said, I first met him, he said, I'm not an activist, but I'm an artist. I said, no, art is your activism. And so I thank you for being that activism in bringing art and using it as your way to speak out and to make a change. Again, the book is Black and Blue. Light Switch Learning is, and I think, I don't know if it can be put in the chat for anybody that's interested in it. We're going to have some amazing programming coming out around to rally this brother and support this brother and to get this book out there into the communities and get it into the hands of as many young people that are interested in reading it. So again, thank you again. Thank you for tuning in and have a great evening.